maybe a question that you've had to answer or ask before is, does it live up to the hype? Does it live up to the hype? There are lots of things in this world, things that do live up to the hype and things that don't live up to the hype. And hype is really just think expectations. Does it meet the expectations that someone places on something? I had this experience when we did go to Denmark over the summer. Had a couple things that Karina's family hyped up many times. Karina going to Denmark like every year growing up because her family's from there. They had a lot of things that it was my first time, and so there were lots of things they were like, oh, you got to try this, you got to try this, you got to try this. And one of the things that they kept hyping up over and over again of when you get to Denmark, you got to go straight for the hot dogs. Hot dogs to me are just okay. The only time I ever get hot dogs, honestly, is when I go to Costco and they're $1.50, or you go to a baseball game or something like that, and they're not very good. Hot dogs are just okay. But I just remember getting off the plane, and immediately her whole family was like, all right, we got to go get hot dogs. We got to go get hot dogs. Because apparently that's a Danish thing to do, is to eat hot dogs. So we get off the plane, we go straight into Copenhagen, and we go get hot dogs. And these were the hot dogs. They were very, very different than the kind of hot dogs we are used to. This one on the left is like a traditional Danish hot dog. It's got like pickles. It's got weird like onions, but in like mustard and ketchup, and then this like special like relish mayo on it. Not very good. And then this other one is just honestly a very tasteless hot dog. It's like a French bread with a hot dog. And I'll tell you this, they all tasted like hot dogs to me. They were bleh. I mean, they were okay, but for the amount of hype that they had for these hot dogs, they did not meet the hype. But I will say, her family hyped up the pastries, the Danish pastries, a lot. And so when we got there, we legitimately went to a bakery every single morning and got fresh pastries every morning. And I will say, this lived up to the hype. It will forever be changed in terms of my view of pastries. I was not a pastry person until I came back from Denmark, and now I love pastries. This top pastry here that doesn't look very good, it's called the Tibirka. It is the greatest pastry on the face of the planet, because we would go into these bakeries every single day and just have sweets on sweets on sweets. And I just remember walking away from those two stands, like a hot dog stand and a bakery, having two very different experiences. Both of them were hyped up. One of them lived up to the hype, and one of them did not live up to the hype. And I think a lot of things in our world today become overhyped very quickly. Lots of things, in the culture, lots of fashion trends or fun things to do. People overhype things all the time. And really what we've been talking about through the book of Ecclesiastes is it really creates the right amount of hype that we should have for certain things in our life. It creates the correct evaluation of the things that we surround ourselves with in this life, because you want things properly hyped. If something is really good, you want it to be hyped up. If something is not very good, you don't want it to be hyped up. And so Ecclesiastes provides that proper evaluation, that proper hype for certain things in our world. And we've been talking a few different things that it's been evaluating here in our life. And tonight we've got another one of those evaluations from Ecclesiastes chapter 5. So I'd love for you guys to open up to Ecclesiastes chapter 5, as it's going to give us a proper hype, a proper evaluation of the things that our world hypes up too much. And specifically, the thing that we're going to address tonight, that the world hypes up very much so, that Ecclesiastes will tell us doesn't live up to the hype, is the concept of money and material possessions. The concept of money and material possessions is going to create a proper evaluation of how we should value our money and our stuff. See, we're surrounded by so much money. We're surrounded by so much stuff all over the place. We live in one of the richest counties in the whole world. So we're surrounded by a lot of money and a lot of stuff. And so we need to, if we're going to be different from the rest of the world, we need to have the proper evaluation of the things that we are surrounding ourselves with. Because the world is going to hype up money like it's a big deal. It's the most important thing. And the Bible is going to teach us tonight. Solomon's going to teach us tonight that we need to properly understand money, because ultimately, if you go after it like the world will tell you to go after it, you will be left feeling empty and broken and worthless and dissatisfied. So, Ecclesiastes chapter 5. We're going to read verses 8 through 20. We'll go verse by verse. But I guess before we jump in, let's just recap the concept that we've been talking about over and over again about this word vanity. Oh, you've mentioned it many times. Vanity. It's It's this idea of emptiness, this idea of a breath or a vapor. And he evaluates things in this world that the world will say, this is really important. And he will say, that's actually worthless if you make that your ultimate God. And so he's been talking about a lot of different things. And if just to recap the book, you don't have to write this table down or anything like that. We've been talking about vanity so much, I wanted to make sure that we go back and look at what we've learned so far. So I got a couple things on the screen. We've got a table for you of all the different things that Solomon said was vanity. The first one in chapter 1, he talked about life in general. Life in general is this empty vapor, vaporless mist. He goes on later in the chapter. The second box here is the vanity of wisdom. And so we talked about what it means to be really smart. And maybe you've got really good grades, or maybe you go to a really good college or something like that. So properly valuing wisdom. The next one in chapter 2 was worldly pleasure. And we saw Solomon go after the pleasures of this world. He goes after success. He goes after money. He goes after sex. He goes after all of these different things that the world tries to tempt him with. And he says, ultimately, that is nothing. The next one in chapter 3 is he talks about success, or chapter 2 rather. He talks about the vanity of success, that being a successful person here on this planet, you've got lots of accomplishments that will not end up in an eternal reward necessarily. The next one he talked about was envying our neighbor. That one should be very obvious to us. Then he goes on in chapter 4 to talk about the vanity of isolation, being alone, not surrounding yourselves with other godly people. And tonight he's going to teach us that something like money, something like material possessions as well, are vanity. So this has been a common theme throughout the book. Ecclesiastes has been properly prioritizing what we are living for. Because every person in this room is living for something. You are living for what you love. Pastor Elliot will oftentimes use the terminology of you will do whatever you worship. Whatever is the most important thing to you, you will pursue it. And if money and material possessions and showing off to your friends certain things that you have, if that is your ultimate priority, then Solomon has a few things for you to learn tonight, properly evaluating our money. And he's going to tell us here, we'll get into it in a second, but I'll have you write down point number 1 before we hop into the text, to make sure that we are not overvaluing things of this world. Write it down this way for point number 1. Beware of overvaluing your money, or as well, in parentheses, your stuff. Beware of overvaluing your money or your stuff. See, the world loves money, and the world loves stuff. And the world will tell you, the more money that you have, the more stuff that you have, the more happy you will be. Money can't buy happiness. You've heard that term many times, and again, that's tossed around because people will often go after money, go after possessions, thinking that it will provide them happiness. He's going to teach us here in a second that we need to properly evaluate the way that you view money. See, okay, well, I'm not trying to be rich. Maybe you're sitting here like, I'm not trying to be greedy. I'm not interested in fancy things, fancy clothing, fancy whatever. I'm not into that kind of stuff. But I think it's easy for us as Christians to over-prioritize the stuff that we have, over-prioritize success in a financial sense, in a money sense. So he's going to teach us here that we need to properly evaluate those things. So if you look at verse 8 with me, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8, kind of break it down verse by verse, but let's read the first few verses right now. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8 talks about this idea of politics and this idea of power at the beginning. Verse 8, it says, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor and violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and yet there is a higher ones above them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. That, at first reading, that doesn't necessarily make sense at all. And what was very, very interesting is I was studying this text, it literally, some of the commentaries I read said, we have no clue what this means. So that was like super helpful to read that this week. But anyway, the idea of these two verses here, of talking about really the vanity of wealth and the vanity of riches, he starts by explaining that this idea of power and this idea of money and this idea of having this political power is ultimately meaningless and vanity as well. And he goes on, verse 10, it says, this is where it gets much more practical. He says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they increase those who eat them. What advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. So what he's trying to do here is he's trying to evaluate how important is money to you. He's explaining this idea of valuing something, overhyping something. It's kind of like inflation. Inflation, maybe you hear that word tossed around nowadays. You look at the gas prices or you look at houses or whatever and talk about inflation a lot. And inflation, it's not super great right now. Not that you really care. But this is not as bad as it's ever been. I don't know if you guys know the story of Germany around the time of World War II, but right before the war, a loaf of bread was about 23 cents, like 25 cents. And then after the war, the Germans kept printing money and money and money. Here's some of the pictures of how much money they had. The kids would use money as a toy, because a loaf of bread went from 20 cents to about $100 billion. One loaf of bread, which in one sense is like, how does that make sense? People were using money because the German government was printing so much money. They were using money as firewood because there was no value attached to every dollar bill that they had. It's just crazy that amount of inflation there. So you see these kids playing here with this stack of money, and really this stack of money looks like a lot of money, but in reality the value right here of all this money is completely worthless. And you might think money or stuff has a lot of value, but in fact he's going to tell us here that it's worthless. If you look back at verse 10, he says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money at all. Maybe you're like, okay, well, I don't really have a job. I'm not like super into money necessarily. So how does this necessarily apply to me? Well, maybe you've heard the term before, and I'm sure you have heard the term before, of materialism. You guys know what materialism is? Materialism is the idea of this preoccupation with the things of this world, with material possessions, worried about the here and now, worried about stuff or possessions or money that you have. And ultimately, the lie of materialism is the more stuff that you have, the happier you'll be, the more satisfied you'll be. If you have a bigger house, you'll be happier. If you have a better car, you'll be happier. If your clothes are nicer, you will be more excited and more joyful and more happy. The lie is that the next thing is the most important thing, and that you need the next thing more and more. 1 Timothy chapter 6 explains how big of a deal this is. If you want money, if you desire to be rich, it explains here. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9, it says, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Maybe you're sitting here right now saying, I don't necessarily want to be rich, but I want to show you tonight that ultimately if you over-prioritize something like the stuff that you have, material possessions that you have, you will walk into more and more kinds of evil. It says, verse 10, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. How do you know if you're doing that? Well, if you're unsatisfied with the stuff that you have, if you look around and you covet or you're jealous or you're envious of the stuff that other people have, if you walk around school and some people have certain items or clothing or backpacks that you don't have and you say, man, I wish I had that. If I did, I would be higher up in the totem pole of popularity, or people would like me more, or you obsessed over the stuff that you have, trying to make yourself look as good as possible with clothes or with your car, trying to upgrade things all the time. Whatever the case may be, it says that the love of money, if even you have a hint of that, it says the root of all kinds of evil. It says it is through this craving that many have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 is a warning to us. 1 Timothy chapter 6 is a warning to us that if you love stuff more than God, there will be lots of destruction and lots of sin that will come from that. It even says that many have wandered away from the faith because of their love of money. So it's an important thing that we understand this. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 gives us a proper evaluation, and the first thing that it teaches us, subpoint A, is that money or stuff is unsatisfying. Money and stuff is completely unsatisfying. Money and stuff is unsatisfying. Ultimately, that's the lie of materialism. The next thing that you have this, upgrade this, and you'll be happy. But the problem is that the more you get, the more unsatisfied you realize that it is. Verse 10, it says, he who loves money will not be satisfied. He who loves his wealth with his income, it's also vanity. It's worthless. It says, when you get more stuff, verse 11, when goods increase, there's an increase of those who eat them. There's more people that want to be your friend because of your money. What advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? You can get so much money that you just don't even know what to do with it. It talks about in verse 12, the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep, that you're so worried about money. The more stuff that you have, the more unsatisfied you will be. See, Apple has done a really good job at always advertising that you need a newer iPhone and a newer iPhone and a newer iPhone. If you go on Apple's website and you go look under the iPhone tab, you can go do this comparison of your different iPhones. And ultimately what this comparison tool does is it shows the screen and the battery life and all the different things about if you upgrade your iPhone, you'll get this much better and better and better and better. Really what this tool is trying to do is they're trying to show you that what you have is not good enough. There's an upgrade that you need, that you should buy, that you should shell out a bunch of money for. This tool helps you confirm that you need a new one, and the next thing will be better than the one before. The world will constantly tell you the more money that you have, the better off you will be. Even think about the sports world right now. Contracts become the biggest contract ever, and then like 2 weeks later, someone else will sign the biggest contract ever, and then 3 weeks later, someone else will sign the biggest contract, and they're always just trying to out-contract each other and try to make more money than each other because these millions and millions of dollars is not enough. There's always a desire for more and for more and for more. So don't believe the lie that more money or the coolest thing or whatever that case may be will make you happier. Sit there in the parking lot and you look at other people's cars and you're like, man, if I only had that car, if I only had enough money for that. You look at other people's stuff, man, if I only had that. You look at other people's vacations or something like that on social media. Well, if I could only go on that vacation, that would be awesome. I would love to have that. I covet that. I'm jealous of that. I'm envious of that. Money and stuff is completely unsatisfying. It's why here in California, where we live in like the richest place in the world with the most money flowing everywhere, why we have the most unsatisfied people on the face of the planet. Why? Because money doesn't satisfy. I don't know if any of you have been to like a third world country before. It's very interesting. You go to a third world country, you see the incredible poverty that some people live in. And they are so much happier than we are. Why? Because they have more stuff? No. There's just this greater perspective that they have when they've got nothing. I remember going to Guatemala when I was in high school and looking at the poverty all over the place, and they were the happiest people I've ever seen in my life. And they had nothing, living in tin shacks on the side of the road, but yet there was this joy and satisfaction in what they had. More money is not the answer. More stuff is not the answer. Verse 11 says that the more money that you have, the more problems you're going to experience. One of the number one causes of conflict in this world is financial conflict, money conflict. I do lots of marriage counseling. You know what comes up a lot in marriage counseling? Money. People spending money that the other spouse doesn't want them to spend, and then it causes more and more problems because money. People care a lot about money, and it causes conflicts. It causes divorce. Causes obsession over money, and it causes, verse 12, this idea of stress and insomnia and just this unhealthy stress over making more money. Ultimately, what Solomon's trying to teach us tonight is that more money is not equal to more satisfaction. He goes on, look at verse 13. He continues to explain how worthless money really is in the grand scheme of things in an eternal sense. Verse 13, he says, this is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he's the father of his son, and he's got nothing in his hand. He's saying here in these two verses is that the money that you get is immediately losable. Nothing that you have is completely secure. You write it down this way for subpoint B is money and stuff it's losable. Money and stuff, it's losable. Not only will you never have enough, but when you get more and more, you can just lose it in a bad venture, he says, in a bad transaction. You can have someone steal your money. Have your investments just liquidated because the market crashes or whatever the case may be. You can lose money. And he says here, this person that hoards all of his stuff, a diligent saver, his security can be gone in an instant. Maybe you're here, like, oh, this whole money conversation, I'm not really someone that cares that much about money, not really someone that cares that much about stuff. Maybe you're someone that views money and stuff as a security blanket. You put your hope in money. And I'm sure you'll experience this more and more as you get older, especially as you move out and you have no money and you realize how little money you have. You see money as a security blanket. You're anxious about it. What's going to happen? Am I going to have enough money to do this or to do that? And money is ultimately a very insecure God. It's an insecure security. It's unstable basis of your trust. It doesn't really say it here in our text, but verses 13 and 14 gives this picture of how unstable and how insecure money is. I don't think it's very hard for you to see that put your hope, put your trust in something like money, you will experience in some insecurity and some instability. But if you put your trust in God, who is completely stable and completely secure, that's where there is hope. Psalm 20, verses 7 and 8 says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord. They collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. There's this idea that if you put your trust in God and not your trust in your stuff, not your trust in your bank account, not even your trust in, everything will be okay because I have backup plans or whatever the case may be. It says when your trust is in anything other than God, it says those people that put their trust in chariots and horses, they collapse and they fall. Money makes a terrible God. Money is a terrible God. But the good news is that God is a good God for us to trust in. So not only is money unsatisfying and losable, it's also, look at verse 15 rather. He goes on to explain that money is a temporary thing. Verse 15, he says, and I came from my mother's womb, and he shall go again, naked as he came, and he shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. For this also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. What gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Not only is it unsatisfying and losable, but subpoint C, money is also temporary. Money is also temporary. Such a good reminder here that the money that you have will expire one day. The stuff that you have, you cannot take with you. Every dollar bill that you have, everything that you own, every single one of those things has an expiration date. You will no longer be able to use it after you die. That cool stuff that you bought will deteriorate, and you will die, and you will leave it behind. I've used this illustration multiple times as we go through the book of Ecclesiastes, but it's like putting all of your hope, all of your attention in this life on Monopoly money. Monopoly money, it has a certain value for a certain period of time when you're playing Monopoly. You can use that money to buy certain things, to do certain things, but when the game is over, those dollar bills in that Monopoly game, they become just pieces of paper. The value that they held while you played the game is no more once the game is over. Really, the point of Ecclesiastes is to say, stop living for monopoly money. Stop living for just the here and now. Stop living for just the temporary, the fun that you can have here on this planet. Ecclesiastes, really the point of it is stop focusing on the here and now, but start focusing on eternity. Start focusing on the there and then, not the here and now. Ultimately says that this is all a grievous evil, that you can't take anything with you. There's no gain. There's no gain is there for him who toils after the wind. The ultimate gain of possessions is to die and to leave it all behind. It's proper perspective for us. Love the way that he ends it here in verse 17, this idea of why money is vanity. He says, verse 17, moreover, all of his days, referring to this rich man that he's been talking about, all of his days he eats in darkness and in much vexation, sickness, and anger. If you live your life for stuff and for money and you take God out of the picture, it gives a really terrible, unenjoyable picture of what your life will be like. Write down this way for subpoint D. Money and your stuff is unenjoyable without God. It's unenjoyable without God. The punchline of this whole passage is that if money is your God, your life will stink, be depressing, will have nothing to show for it, nothing to live for more than the stuff that you have, the house that you've bought. He doesn't say money is bad necessarily. He's going to clarify in the last few verses of why money is not bad. But he says if money is the most important thing in your life, then this is your future right here. All of your days eating in darkness and in much vexation, sickness, and anger. It is why the richest people in the world are some of the most depressed people in the world. Eating, if you will, in darkness, vexation, sickness, and anger. As you write that subpoint D down, you probably think to yourself, well, I don't know about that. It looks like the world is having a lot of fun with the stuff that they have and the money that they make. Sounds like they're having a good time. Really what Solomon's trying to do is he's trying to give us the perspective that the shallowness of life, if you don't have God in it, the worthlessness and the unfulfillment, the unsatisfaction that you'll have without God. You can write this one down as well, Jeremiah 2:13. It says, for my people have committed two evils. They've forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. If you live your life for anything other than God, this is what you're looking at. Hewing out for yourselves cisterns that can hold no water. Disillusioned to think that you are finding fulfillment and satisfaction and worth in this life, in the stuff that you have, in the clothes that you wear, in the cars that you drive, in even the abilities that you have, being able to purchase with the money that you have. It says it is worthless, and you will leave this earth with nothing. Spending your days in darkness, much vexation, sickness, and anger. There's this picture of dissatisfaction in a life lived for someone other or something other than God. This idea of satisfaction, this idea of fulfillment, you're not able to purchase it with money or stuff that you have. It's ultimately cultivated with a proper understanding of who God is and how he gives these things to us. So let's continue verse 18 to see the punchline of the solution that we have here of what we should be doing, how we should be viewing our stuff that we have. Verse 18, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 18. He says, behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and to drink and to find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun in the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, to accept his lot and to rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. He will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. If you're going to properly understand how you as a Christian should think about the stuff and the material possessions and the money that you have, you need to write down this way for point number 2. Enjoy your portion as a gift from God. Enjoy your portion. The stuff that God has given you, the money that God has given you, even the abilities that God has given you. Enjoy your portion as a gift from God. What's so cool about this text is he doesn't say, hey, all this money stuff is bad, so don't make money. Don't have money. Don't even enjoy the things that money can offer. He says enjoy it with God at the focal point of it. There's a solution to this whole dilemma of how should I think about money, and ultimately the solution is God. God is the one that gives you everything that you have. Not only is he sustaining your heartbeat and keeping breath in your lungs, but he also has given you every dollar bill, every t-shirt, every pair of shoes, every laptop, every phone that you own. God has graciously given that to you. And you have this opportunity to enjoy it, but if he is the focal point, if he is God and the stuff is second, and ultimately you are keeping him at the forefront of your mind and ultimately understanding him as the one that gives these gifts, not making these gifts more important than they really should be. Verses 8 through 17, there's no picture of God. There's no reference to God. But in verses 18 through 20, he uses the word God 4 different times, trying to show you a picture of a non-Christian that lives their life for stuff and a Christian who lives their life for God and has stuff to go along with it. Guys, I think that is good news, that the solution here is not go live like a monk and go be poor and go live on the side of the road, and that's what you should do. That's not what God is telling you to do. He's telling you with whatever you have, you can enjoy it as long as you're not using, obviously, what you have to sin, of course, and you're properly prioritizing God as the first and foremost in your life. It's not a sin to be rich. It's not a sin to have wealth. It is a sin to make that more important than God. The biblical word for that is idolatry, right? What is idolatry? Placing anything above God, making something more important than God himself. So that's what he's trying to get us to do here. So how can we properly enjoy what God has given to us? First way is to just be satisfied with what he has given to us. Subpoint A, find satisfaction in God, not in money or stuff. Find satisfaction in God, not in money or stuff. As we said in point number 1, that money does not satisfy, stuff does not satisfy. Ultimately, the solution is God is the only thing that satisfies. You see verse 20 here, he says, you will not remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. There's this contentedness, there's this satisfaction, there's this joy in serving God. And then graciously accepting the gifts that God has given to us. I'm sure you know the story of the rich young ruler. Remember the story of the rich young ruler? He comes up to Jesus and he says, this is Matthew 19, if you want to write it down, Matthew 19, 16 through 30. The rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and says, I want to follow you. And Jesus is like, okay, great. Keep the commandments. And he goes through the different commandments. And rich young ruler says, yeah, I've kept all of those. What else do I still lack? And Jesus says, go sell all of your possessions and then follow me. And the guy, he walks away sorrowful because he was a rich guy and he did not want to sell all of his possessions because ultimately his God was his stuff and his God was misplaced, was not God. He chooses stuff over God and he pays the penalty for that. You can also write to Matthew 16 as well. Matthew 16 verses 24 through 26. How do we find satisfaction in God alone? We have to follow him with our whole heart. Matthew 16, 24 through 26, Jesus tells his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life would lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? If you trade stuff and money for God, this is your future. To gain the whole world, to have as much money in the world, to be able to be Elon Musk and buy Twitter. You can have everything here in this world, and ultimately you will die and you will meet God. And if you have not bowed the knee to Jesus Christ, if you have not taken up your cross to follow him, then all of that profit will lead to nothing. Absolutely nothing. I love the question there that he asked, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? And this one right here, what shall a man give in return for his soul? Good question for you to ask yourself tonight is, where do you find satisfaction? Where do you find fulfillment? Is it in the stuff that you have? You feel lonely, or you feel like you need a pick-me-up, or you feel depressed in a certain way? Do you go to stuff to help answer that, to help fill you up, to help satisfy you? Or do you go to God? The stuff that you go after will not give you what you are hoping for. Money, as we've been saying, makes a terrible God, but God makes a great God. You've got to trust him instead. Look at verse 19. He says, for everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, to accept their lot and to rejoice in his toil, for this is a gift of God. If you're going to try to enjoy your portion as a gift from God, write it down this way for subpoint B. Express thankfulness to the gift giver. Express thankfulness to the gift giver. Recognizing God is the one who has given you everything that you have and thanking him for it. There's nothing that you own. There's nothing that you possess that God has not, in his perfect will, planned for you to have. Chosen for you to be born into the family that you were born into, with the amount of money that your dad makes, with the amount of money that your mom makes. God chose that specifically, sovereignly, for you and for your life. Therefore, express thankfulness to him. Taking those things for granted, feeling like you've earned it, feeling like you deserve it, is not the right mentality. Correct on James 1:17, it says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Everything you have is from God. It's from above. Every good and perfect gift. Every vacation that you've been on. Every article of clothing that is nice and not nice as well. Every phone that you have, your car, everything that you have is from God. Do you recognize him as the one that's given it to you, or do you take it for granted and express no thankfulness? You guys remember the story of Jesus and the lepers, the 10 lepers? He heals these 10 lepers. 9 of them go away. 1 of them comes back to thank him. You see that story just makes you feel gross about thanklessness, of not caring about the gift that Jesus had given to these guys to heal them. That's what we look like when we don't thank God for the things that we've given him, the things that he's given to us, rather. What if you're more diligent at thanking God for the stuff that you have, for the money that you have, for the vacations that you get to go on, for the car that you drive, for the house that you are in, for the school that you go to? Everything that you have, are you grateful for it, or do you take it for granted? Not only that, he tells us to do something very hard. If you look at the end of verse 18, he uses this word, for this is his lot. And then in the middle of verse 19, he says to accept his lot. What is the idea of lot? It's a portion. It's a set possession that God has chosen to give you. And what he's saying here is you need to be content with what God has given you. So write down this way for subpoint C. Be content with your portion. Be content with your portion. What I mean by portion is the stuff that God has given you. Be content with your lot, with your portion. See, here's the thing. We want to complain about the stuff that we have or the stuff that we don't have. We want to complain that we don't have enough, or we want to look at what someone else has and say, if I only had that. Looking around at everyone else. Solomon tells us to stop it, to enjoy the portion that God has given to us, and to stop being discontent. It's not just Solomon that tells us to do this, but Paul in Philippians chapter 4 as well. Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13, he says, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In every and any circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And then there's this famous verse, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That familiar verse there, Philippians 4:13, is in the context of contentment. The context of accepting your lot. The stuff that you have, not looking around and wishing you had what everyone else has, but being content with what God has given to you and where God has placed you in life. I want you to think about these 3 sins that are very, very hard to fight. Coveting, envy, and jealousy. Coveting, envy, and jealousy. Those three sins right there are hard. Why? Because they have to do with discontentment. They have to do with the opposite of what he's telling us to do here, to accept our lot and to be content with the portion that God has given to us. What do we want to do? We want to look at what everyone else has and say, if I only had that. Is that what you do when you go to school? Is that what you do when you go on social media? Is that what you do when you look at what other people here have? Looking over the fence at someone else's yard and saying, if I only had that. This picture of looking over the fence is a picture that I think you need etched into your brain when you think about coveting, envy, and jealousy. What God is saying, hey, you've got a lot. You've got a backyard. Be content with what I've given to you. Stop looking over the fence at what everyone else has. God cares about this so much that he put it in the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 10 is about coveting. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's bondservant, oxen, sheep, all of these things. You shall not covet. You shall not look at what someone else has and say, if I only had that, I want that. And I resent that person for having that. If you let this sin fester in your heart when it comes to money and it comes to stuff, it's a really bad place to be. Walking in a lot of sin when you do that. Again, that's really what the world is all about. If you only had this, you'll be content. Have what I have. That's what advertisements are all about. You don't have something that you should have, so you should buy this. You should have this. God has given you exactly what he wants to give you. And when you covet, when you are jealous, when you are envious, really what you're telling God is, God, you messed up. God, you messed up. You should have done it this way. You should have given me this instead. And I don't think anyone here in this room wants to tell God that he's done a bad job. But that's what we do when we covet. That's what we do when we're envious or jealous, looking over the fence at what other people have, to be discontent with what God has given to us. See, God has been so kind to us in so many ways. He's given us so many gifts. It's important for us to rightly understand how to properly have the right perspective about money and stuff, but also we need to spend our time building our eternal bank account, if you will. Not being so worried about the here and now, but worried about the there and then. And I thought there'd be no better passage for us to conclude the night with than Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. Love for you guys to turn there with me as we close our time together. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. I know you know these verses, but let's read it afresh as we think about materialism, as we think about the stuff and the money that is so tempting for us to covet and to be jealous and to be envious of. Let's make sure that we are living for the there and then, not the here and now. So let's close with this. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 through 21. Jesus, teaching here, says, Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. What he's doing there is he's confronting the here and now, living for materialism, living for the stuff that you have here on this planet. He says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Verse 20, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I think the question that we need on all of our minds tonight as we hop into small groups here in a couple minutes is, what are you living for? Where are you storing up treasure? Are you storing up treasure here on this earth, or are you storing up treasure in heaven? Because ultimately, if you can answer that the right way, your week will look different. The way that you obsess your mind and what you think about will look different. If ultimately your first and foremost priority is to store up treasure in heaven, not treasure on this earth. Let's take this warning here from Solomon to make God our number one priority, to obey him, to trust him, to please him, to not worry about the stuff that we have or the stuff that we don't have. So let's bow our heads, pray right now. Hop into small groups here in a second. God, we thank you for this important warning for us tonight about money. God, something that we rarely talk about is something, the concept of money and how to think through it like a Christian. But God, we thank you for the reminder tonight that we so desperately need, that we need to make sure that you are our number one priority. Make sure that we love you and not the stuff that you've given to us as more important than you. So God, I pray, and this would be helpful for every student, that they would candidly and humbly look at their life as they try to evaluate what they truly are living for, where they're storing up treasure right now. I pray for every student in this room storing up for themselves treasures on this earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. God, may you use even the small groups that we're about to hop into tonight. May you use those to convict them, to turn them in repentance and faith to you, that they would take up their cross and follow you. For what would it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet loses his soul? God, help us this week store up for ourselves treasures in heaven, not treasures on this earth. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.